Good evening and welcome back. Get comfortable now. Pull the blanket a little higher. Let the pillow take the weight of your head and allow the thoughts of a hectic day disappear. They can no longer reach you. Let go of any negative thoughts. As you settle into the warmth of your bed, feel the safety of your room. Tonight we are going to travel back in time to a place where warmth was a luxury and the night was a silent adversary. We are going to look at the shadows of the past and ask a question that bridges our comfort with their survival. Have you ever imagined what it was actually like to live inside a medieval castle? The picture looks grand from the outside, but step inside as a servant in the middle of January and the romance fades pretty quickly. That image of a medieval castle, all towering stone and candlelit grandeur, tends to come with an unspoken assumption that the people living inside must have been absolutely freezing. And honestly, for a lot of them, a lot of the time, that assumption isn't entirely wrong. Stone walls don't hold heat the way wood or plaster do. Drafts find their way through every gap, and the higher you climb in those towers, the colder and lonelier it gets. So when you start to wonder how the servants actually managed, how they slept, how they stayed warm enough to wake up the next morning and do it all over again, it turns out to be a genuinely fascinating question. Because castle life wasn't one single experience. It varied enormously, depending on where you were in Europe. Whether you were in the mild dampness of southern England or the bitter winters of northern France, or somewhere in the mountains where snow sat on the ground for months at a time. It varied depending on the wealth of the lord or lady running the household, on the size of the castle itself, and on the season. A warm September and a frozen February inside the same building could feel like completely different worlds. And then there was rank. Not your rank out in the wider world, but your place within the household itself. A senior steward or a lady's personal attendant occupied a very different position from a young stable hand or a kitchen scullion just starting out. The closer you were to the lord and lady, the more likely you were to sleep somewhere that had at least a fighting chance of retaining a little warmth. The further down the ladder you sat, the more you were left to solve the problem of the cold largely on your own, with whatever was available. What's interesting, though, is that survival in those conditions depended less on comfort than we might expect. There wasn't a solution that made servant life in a medieval castle warm and cosy in the way we'd recognise today. There was no central heating waiting to be invented, no insulated walls, no thick double-glazed windows keeping the wind out. What there was instead was routine, materials that had been used and refined over generations, a kind of practical adaptation that became second nature to the people living it, even if it sounds remarkably harsh to us now. The answers are spread across a few different places: the rooms themselves, where they were positioned and how they were built, the fires that burned through the night in some parts of the castle and not at all in others, the bedding that servants actually slept on, which looked nothing like a modern mattress, the clothing worn to sleep in, layered and practical rather than decorative, the simple human instinct to share body heat in a room full of other people doing exactly the same thing, and the daily rhythm of physical work that kept blood moving and bodies warm, even when the building itself offered very little help. Over the course of this video, we're going to look at all of those things carefully. We'll talk about who the servants actually were and where they fit in the castle hierarchy. We'll look at the rooms and spaces they slept in and why those spaces were placed where they were. We'll get into the specifics of fire and heat, of straw pallets and wool blankets, of sleeping clothes and shared warmth, and we'll take a look at how the seasons changed everything, and at what happens when the cold stops being merely uncomfortable and starts being genuinely dangerous. So settle in. This is the kind of history that doesn't get talked about as much as battles and banquets, but in a lot of ways it's more revealing, because it's the story of ordinary people solving an ordinary problem night after night, in a world that offered them very few easy answers. Before we get into the sleeping arrangements themselves, it helps to understand exactly who we're talking about when we say the word servant, because that single word covers an enormous range of people, and the differences between them were enormous too. A medieval castle wasn't staffed by one uniform group of people doing roughly similar work for roughly similar rewards. It was a layered, carefully organised household with a social structure almost as complex as the wider world outside its walls. At the very top of that structure, right below the lord and lady themselves, you had the senior household officers, the steward or seneschal who managed the entire running of the estate, the chamberlain who oversaw the lord's private apartments and personal needs, the marshal who controlled the stables and horses and much of the movement in and out of the castle. These were men, almost always men at this level, who came from relatively well-off backgrounds, who had real authority over the people below them, and whose position within the household came with genuine privileges, a comfortable sleeping space, access to the warmer parts of the building, sometimes even a room of their own, or shared only with one or two others. They were servants in the technical sense, but their day-to-day lives looked nothing like what we usually picture when we use that word. Below them came a wide middle layer, pages and squires from noble or gentry families who were essentially learning courtly life by serving in it. Gentlewomen and ladies in waiting who attended the lady of the household and came from backgrounds nearly as elevated as hers. Clerks and chaplains who handled correspondence, accounts, and the spiritual life of the castle. These people occupied an interesting position. They were serving, yes, but they understood themselves as being on a kind of upward trajectory, learning skills and making connections that would serve them later. Their sleeping situations were generally better than those of the people below them, though still a long way from luxurious by any modern standard. Then came the working core of the household, the cooks and their assistants, the bakers, the brewers, the laundresses, the grooms who tended the horses, the guards who walked the walls at night, the huntsmen, the falconers, the smiths, the people who kept the physical reality of the castle functioning day after day, season after season. Some of these roles carried a degree of status, especially the master cook or the head groom, who had years of skill and knowledge behind them. Others were simply labour, skilled or unskilled, essential but not particularly valued beyond their usefulness. And at the very bottom were the people who did the work that nobody else wanted to. The kitchen scullions, who scrubbed pots in cold water before dawn. The boys who carried firewood and ash. The stable lads who slept close to the animals because that was simply where they were needed. Young, often very young, sometimes barely into their teens, These were the people whose sleeping arrangements were the most basic, the most exposed, and the most dependent on whatever accidental warmth they could find. What that hierarchy meant, in practical terms, was that rank determined almost everything about how you experienced life inside that building, including how warm you were when you closed your eyes at night. The steward might have a chamber with a fireplace and a proper bed with a straw or feather mattress and several wool blankets. The scullion sleeping near the kitchen hearth might have a thin pallet on the floor and a single worn covering. Both of them were servants. The distance between their experiences was enormous. It's also worth separating out the people who lived in the castle permanently from those who were there on a temporary basis. A great household was constantly in motion. Travellers arrived and needed accommodation. Visiting knights brought their own attendants. Seasonal workers came in at harvest time or for specific tasks and then moved on. A merchant delivering goods might sleep one night in a corner of the great hall before heading out the next morning. These temporary presences complicated the picture considerably. They weren't part of the permanent household with established sleeping places and known routines. They were slotted in wherever space could be found, which often meant the coldest and least comfortable corners of whichever room had room to spare. Gender also shaped the picture significantly. Female servants, whether high-ranking ladies-in-waiting or low-ranking laundresses, typically slept in spaces separated from the male household. A lady-in-waiting would sleep in or very near the lady's own chamber, sometimes on a pallet at the foot of the bed, sometimes in a small adjoining room. This proximity to the mistress of the household was both a privilege and an obligation. It meant warmth because the ladies' room was better heated than most. It also meant being available at any hour of the night if needed. Lower-ranking women servants were generally kept in their own grouped sleeping areas, away from the male quarters. This was practical, it was social convention, and it shaped the whole geography of who slept where. Age mattered too. The very young servants, those pages and boys just starting out, were often grouped together under the supervision of a more senior person. They weren't trusted with independent sleeping arrangements. They were managed, moved, directed. An older and more experienced servant might have a more fixed sleeping place that was understood to be more or less his or hers in the long term. That stability made a real difference. If you knew where you slept night after night, you could gather small things around you. An extra blanket kept back from the laundry, a straw mattress that was yours rather than shared. Those small accumulations of personal comfort added up over time. And then there was the question of job role in a more specific sense. Certain positions required you to sleep in particular places, regardless of your personal preference. The watchman obviously slept during the day if he worked the night watch, which meant finding rest somewhere unusual and often cold. The groom slept near the horses because horses needed supervision around the clock. The cook's boys were up before anyone else in the castle to start the fires and begin the preparations for the day's meals, which meant sleeping close enough to the kitchen to reach it quickly in the dark. Your job determined your geography, and your geography determined your relationship to warmth and cold in ways that had nothing to do with personal choice. What all of this adds up to is a picture that pushes back against the simple, romantic image of the medieval castle as one shared experience, the servants were not a uniform group huddled together in identical discomfort. They were a layered community with clear internal divisions, and those divisions had real physical consequences. The higher you sat in the household, the more control you had over your own comfort. The lower you sat, the more the building itself decided the terms of your survival. None of this was considered particularly unjust by the people living it, at least not in the way we might see it from the outside. It was simply the order of things. Everyone understood where they stood, what they were owed, and what they couldn't expect. The senior steward didn't share his sleeping space with the kitchen boy, not out of cruelty, but out of a deep and shared understanding of how a household was supposed to be arranged. Rank was real, and it reached into every corner of daily life, including the most basic one of all. Where you laid your head when the day's work was finally done. That understanding of who the servants were and how differently they lived from one another, even within the same walls, is really the foundation of everything that comes next. Because when we start looking at where people slept in these buildings, we're not looking for one answer. We're looking for a spectrum of answers, from the reasonably comfortable to the genuinely brutal, shaped by a social order that decided in advance who deserved warmth and who was simply expected to manage. And it's in the managing, in the specific and practical and sometimes surprisingly ingenious ways that ordinary servants dealt with the problem of the cold, that the most interesting parts of the story start to emerge. So with that picture of the household in mind, let's follow those servants to bed, or at least to wherever they ended up lying down when the day finally released them. The honest answer to where medieval castle servants slept is everywhere. Not in some vague or imprecise way, but literally everywhere, that the building had a surface flat enough to lie on and enough shelter from the worst of the wind. Corridors, lofts, alcoves, gatehouses, storerooms, stables, the spaces beneath staircases, the far corners of the great hall, the cramped areas just outside a lord's chamber door. The castle was a sleeping map as much as a working one, and reading that map tells you a great deal about power, practicality, and the strange logic of medieval domestic life. Start with the Great Hall, because that's where much of the castle's communal life happened, including the communal life of sleep. During the evening meal, the hall was full of people, noise, firelight, and the smell of food. When that same meal was finished and the tables were cleared or pushed aside, a significant number of the lower household simply lay down on the floor or on benches and went to sleep where they were. Grooms, guards off duty, visiting attendants, the junior members of various departments who had nowhere more specific to go. The fire in the Great Hall was a serious fire, large enough to heat a genuinely impressive space, and proximity to it was understood as a practical asset. Sleeping near the hearth in the hall wasn't embarrassing, it was sensible. It was also first come, first served, which meant the slowest or lowest ranking members of the group ended up furthest from the warmth, near the draughty doors or against the stone walls. The kitchens pulled people in a similar way, and for similar reasons. A working castle kitchen generated enormous amounts of heat. The ovens ran almost continuously. The fires beneath the spits were maintained through long portions of the day and evening, and the accumulated warmth in those stone walls lasted well into the night. Kitchen servants, the scullions and the boys who kept the fires fed, often slept right there in the kitchen itself or in the immediate area just outside it. This wasn't always a comfortable arrangement. Kitchens were smoky, loud during working hours, and not designed with sleeping in mind. But they were warm, and in winter that calculation overrode most others. A thin pallet on a kitchen floor next to a still warm oven was a better option than a more spacious corner, somewhere the cold had full run of the place. The gatehouses and guard towers presented a different kind of sleeping situation. Men whose job required them to be present at the gates, at the walls, at the points where the castle met the outside world, slept in and around those spaces by necessity. Gatehouses often had small chambers built into them for exactly this purpose, not luxurious by any measure, but at least purposeful. Someone had considered that people would need to be here all night, and had provided a room, however small, however stark. That was a step above simply finding a corner. It meant a degree of permanence, a space that was understood to belong to a particular role, even if not to a particular person. Up in the lofts above stables and storage areas, you find another layer of sleeping arrangements. Stable lads and grooms often bedded down above the animals. This sounds unpleasant, and in many ways it was, but the animals below generated warmth that rose through the floor, and hay-filled lofts, while dusty and smelling powerfully of horse, held heat better than bare stone chambers. It was a practical arrangement, one that the animals' caretakers often accepted, not just because they were told to, but because they understood the benefit. Being near the horses also meant being immediately available if something went wrong in the night, which was the other reason the position existed. In wealthier and more established households, you do start to find something more deliberate. Purpose-built sleeping rooms for particular groups of servants, especially the higher-ranking ones. A chamberlain might have a small room adjacent to the lord's private apartments, there by design because his role required constant availability. Ladies-in-waiting slept in or near the lady's own chamber, sometimes on pallets arranged around the room, sometimes in a small antechamber that gave a little more privacy. Senior officers occasionally had rooms they could properly call their own, or shared with just one other person of similar standing. These spaces were still far from what we'd recognise as comfortable bedrooms, but they were intentional. Someone had thought about where these people would sleep and had provided accordingly. The contrast with more improvised arrangements elsewhere in the same building is stark. A junior laundress might be sleeping in a corner of the laundry area with no particular provision made for her at all. A young page just arrived in the household might spend weeks sleeping wherever he was directed, in whatever space was available, before any settled arrangement emerged. Temporary workers brought in for seasonal tasks were often given no sleeping space at all, beyond the general permission to find a spot in whichever room had room. The floor of the great hall again, the edge of the kitchen, a pile of straw in an outbuilding. What ties all of these different places together is a logic that has almost nothing to do with the modern idea of a bedroom as a private, dedicated, personal space. Medieval servants slept where their work put them, where heat was available, and where their position in the household said they belonged. Proximity to a heat source mattered more than almost anything else. A servant who slept near a fire was a servant who survived the winter in reasonable health. A servant who ended up in a cold corridor or an unheated storeroom was fighting the building every night of the cold season. The sleeping arrangements were also fluid in a way that's worth sitting with for a moment. These weren't fixed, permanent setups that never changed. People moved, rooms were repurposed. A storeroom became sleeping space in winter and reverted to storage in summer. A chamber near the Lord's apartments might be cleared entirely when visitors arrived, and everyone shuffled elsewhere to accommodate the guests. The sleeping geography of a castle was alive, shifting, rearranged by the demands of the household, the season, and whoever had the authority to decide where everyone went. What it was not, for the vast majority of people in that building, was private, and that shared, crowded, sometimes uncomfortably close nature of servants sleeping is something worth holding on to as we start to look at what they were actually sleeping in. So now that we know where servants slept, the next question is what the building itself was actually doing to them while they slept. Because the castle, for all its solidity and grandeur, was not a building designed with human warmth as its first priority. It is designed with defence, prestige, and permanence in mind. Warmth was something you negotiated with it, not something it offered freely. The stone is where this starts. Those thick walls that made a castle resistant to siege weapons and centuries of weather were the same walls that made the interior a complicated place to keep warm. There's a tempting assumption that thick walls must mean good insulation, and there's a grain of truth in it. Stone does absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, which means a room that has been well heated for several hours will hold some of that warmth into the night. But that same property works in the other direction. A wall that has been cold for days, through a long frost or a particularly bitter stretch of winter, is a wall that will pull heat out of any room it surrounds. The stone doesn't sit neutrally. It participates, and in winter it participates on the side of the cold. And medieval castles were, in ways that matter enormously if you're the one trying to sleep, full of gaps. Every door was a potential draught. The heavy wooden doors at the castle's main entrances, the internal doors between halls and passages, the smaller doors to individual rooms and storerooms, all of them fitted imperfectly against stone frames that had been cut and shaped by hand. A gap of even a few millimetres under a door becomes something you feel very clearly when you're lying on the floor beside it. The shutters on windows were better than nothing, and a good deal better than open holes in the wall, but they too had their failures. Shutters warp. They crack. They develop small splits where the wood dries unevenly, and through those splits comes air that has travelled from outside with nothing to slow it down. Stairwells were particularly notorious for this. A spiral staircase in a castle tower acts almost like a chimney in reverse, a column of cold air that flows down from the exposed upper levels and pushes through whatever doorway or archway it meets at the bottom. Servants sleeping near the base of a stairwell would have known exactly what that meant on a windy night. The geometry of the great hall compounded all of this. Those high ceilings that looked so impressive during feasts, that gave the space its sense of scale and importance, work directly against the people sleeping on the floor. Heat rises. This is not a subtle or deniable principle, and in a room with a ceiling 20 feet above the heads of the people trying to stay warm, the fire in the centre, or at one end, was doing a great deal of work that benefited the air near the rafters far more than the air near the ground. A servant lying on the hall floor in January was in the coldest zone of the room, regardless of how large the fire was. The warmest air was floating above them, useless, while the cold settled down against the floor where they were trying to sleep. But it's worth being careful here, because the picture of every castle as a uniformly icy box of misery is too simple. The people who built and maintained these structures were not indifferent to cold, and over time and across different places and periods, they developed ways of softening what the stone alone would do. Timber was one of them. Many castle interiors incorporated wooden panelling, wooden partitions, and wooden screens that broke up large stone spaces into smaller, more manageable ones. Wood doesn't conduct cold the way stone does, so a wall lined with timber, or a partition made entirely of it, changes the thermal character of a space noticeably. You're no longer pressed against something that wants to pull the heat out of your body. You're against something that sits closer to neutral. Hangings did something similar, and were used widely in households that could afford them. Tapestries and heavy fabric panels hung against stone walls did two things at once. They covered the stone directly, reducing the surface area of cold material that the room's air was in contact with, and they trapped a layer of air between the fabric and the wall itself, which acted as a buffer. The rooms of wealthy lords were often densely hung with textiles for exactly this reason, though it was understood as decoration before it was understood as temperature management. The practical effect was real either way. A chamber with well-hung tapestries was meaningfully warmer than the same chamber stripped bare, and servants who worked in those rooms and slept nearby would have felt the difference. Plaster was another factor. Walls that had been plastered and perhaps painted sealed the stone more effectively, reduced the movement of cold air through small cracks and gaps, and again created a slight buffer between the inhabited space and the raw material of the building. Not every castle had plastered interiors throughout, but where it existed it contributed to a somewhat more temperate environment. What this means in practice is that not all parts of a castle were equally cold, and not all castles were equal to each other. A well-maintained, well-furnished great chamber with plastered walls and good hangings and a sensibly designed fireplace was a genuinely different thermal environment from a bare stone guardroom at the top of a tower with a broken shutter and a stairwell at its back. Both were in the same building. Both were places where people slept, but the experiences were separated by a distance that mattered enormously in the middle of a hard winter. The servants navigating all of this weren't thinking about it in technical terms. They were thinking about whether they were cold and what they could do about it. The building set the conditions and they worked within them. Understanding those conditions is what lets us understand why fire, of which there was never quite enough, was at the centre of so much of daily and nightly life in a medieval castle. And so we arrive at fire, the thing that the building could not provide on its own, the thing that every person inside those walls, from the Lord himself down to the youngest kitchen boy, understood as the actual source of warmth. Stone gave you the shell, fire gave you the possibility of surviving it comfortably. The hearth was the centre of castle life, in a way that's difficult to fully appreciate from the distance of several centuries of central heating. In the great hall, the hearth was often enormous, a fireplace built into one of the end walls, or in earlier castles, a central fire pit with a louvered opening in the roof above to let the smoke escape. Either way, it was burning for most of the day during the colder months, fed constantly by servants whose job included the relentless labour of keeping it going. In the kitchen, the fire was even more indispensable, burning almost without interruption because cooking required it, because roasting and boiling and baking demanded sustained heat across most of the waking hours of every single day. And in the private chambers of the lord and higher-ranking members of the household, smaller fireplaces cut directly into the walls provided a more intimate and concentrated warmth. These were the three main nodes of heat in a working castle: the hall, the kitchen, the chamber. And for the servants, the critical thing to understand is that none of those fires were primarily for them. The hall fire burned to warm the space where meals were served and where the household gathered. The kitchen fire burned to cook. The chamber fire burned for whoever occupied that chamber. The servants who fed these fires, who carried the wood or peat, who stoked and adjusted and rebuilt them through the day, were performing labour in the warmth rather than receiving warmth as a benefit in itself. The distinction mattered when the fire died down or was banked for the night, because fires did not burn freely through the night in most parts of the castle. Fuel was not an unlimited resource. Wood had to be cut, transported, stored and rationed. Peat, where it was used, required its own management and supply. A large castle household burned through substantial quantities of both, and whoever was responsible for managing that supply, typically the steward or a household officer, with an eye on the accounts, was not inclined to let fires burn wastefully when the rooms they heated were empty or their occupants asleep. By late evening, most fires in secondary spaces were reduced, banked down, meaning buried under ash to slow the burning and preserve the embers, or simply allowed to fade to a low glow that would catch again in the morning if someone tended it before it went cold entirely. This practice of banking a fire was so routine and so universal that it barely gets mentioned in the records of the period, which is itself telling. It was simply what you did. You didn't let a fire die completely if you could avoid it, because relighting a fire from scratch in the morning required effort, and sometimes real difficulty, depending on what you had to work with. But you also didn't leave it burning high through the small hours of the night. You found the middle state, the banked coal and ash that held enough heat to restart from, and you left it there. What this meant for sleeping servants was that they were not being kept warm by active fire. They were benefiting from what the fire had already done. Residual warmth is a real thing. A room that has been well heated for several hours retains some of that heat for some time afterward, especially if the door is kept closed and the drafts are manageable. A hearth full of banked embers still radiates something into the room around it. The stone of the fireplace itself, thoroughly heated through the day, gives back warmth slowly through the night. A servant sleeping near the kitchen fireplace, or close to the hall hearth, was not sleeping in the cold that a servant further away was sleeping in, even after the main fire was reduced. They were sleeping in the slow exhale of warmth that the fire had deposited into the surrounding materials, and that was not nothing. Braziers offered another option, though one with complications of their own. A brazier is essentially a portable container for burning fuel, small enough to be moved from room to room, useful for adding warmth to a space that didn't have its own fireplace, or where the main hearth was too far away to be felt. They were used in sleeping chambers, in certain workrooms, and in spaces where servants gathered. The limitation was smoke. A brazier burning wood produces smoke, and in a room without good ventilation, that smoke becomes a problem faster than the warmth becomes a benefit. Charcoal burned cleaner, but charcoal in an enclosed space produced its own silent danger, a danger that people in the medieval period did not fully understand, but sometimes encountered in its fatal form. A well-managed brazier in a reasonably ventilated space was genuinely useful. A poorly managed one was something else entirely. Bread ovens were also part of this picture, in ways that often get overlooked. A large baking oven, once heated to the temperature needed for bread, held that heat for a surprisingly long time. After the baking was finished and the bread removed, the oven itself was still warm, still radiating into the kitchen and the spaces immediately adjacent. Servants who worked in or near the kitchen and slept nearby were sleeping in an environment that had been heated not just by the cooking fire, but by the sustained operation of that oven through the day. The kitchen, in this sense, was the most reliably warmed space in the castle for those at the lower end of the household hierarchy. Not because anyone designed it that way, but because warmth was a byproduct of the work being done there. What all of this adds up to is a picture of heat in a medieval castle that was always present somewhere, always meaningful where it existed, and never quite enough to go around. The fire gave you something, but it gave it unevenly, temporarily, and always with conditions attached. The servants who slept warmest were the ones who had positioned themselves, through circumstance or habit or clever arrangement, closest to where the heat was already going. So if the fire was what determined whether you felt warmth at all, the surface you slept on determined whether the cold got you anyway. Because a servant who managed to sleep near the kitchen hearth, but did so lying directly on the stone floor, was still losing heat from below throughout the night, steadily, quietly, in the way that cold stone pulls warmth out of anything resting against it. The floor was the enemy in a way that the walls almost weren't. Walls you could move away from. The floor was simply where you were. This is the thing that tends to get lost when people imagine medieval sleeping arrangements. We think about comfort, about softness, about the difference between a fine feather mattress and a rough pile of straw. But for a servant at the lower end of a castle household, the more pressing question was never really about softness. It was about elevation, getting your body up off the stone, even by a few inches, even by means of something rough and imperfect, change the entire thermal calculation of your night. A proper bedstead, the kind with a wooden frame and ropes or slats to support a mattress, was not something most servants owned or used. Those belonged to the lord, to the lady, to senior members of the household who had chambers of their own and enough standing to justify the expense of furniture. A proper bed with a good frame and a stuffed mattress and curtains to hold in warmth was an object of real value, something that appeared in wills and household inventories alongside silver and land. It was not a servant's possession. What servants used instead was the pallet. A pallet was essentially a mattress without a frame, a cloth bag filled with some kind of stuffing material, laid directly on the floor. Some pallets were barely more than a rough sack loosely filled with straw. Others were better made, with a tighter covering and a more carefully packed interior that kept its shape through the night, rather than flattening immediately under a person's weight. The difference in quality between a good pallet and a poor one was significant, but even the most modest pallet accomplished the basic and necessary thing of putting a layer of insulating material between the sleeper's body and the stone beneath them. Straw was the most common stuffing, and it was genuinely effective at the job it was asked to do. Dry straw is a decent insulator. The hollow stems trap air, and air is what slows the movement of heat from one surface to another. A thick layer of dry straw, packed into a cloth bag and placed between a sleeping body and cold stone, interrupted that connection in a way that nothing else so cheap and readily available could manage. Chaff, the husks left over from threshing grain, served a similar purpose and was often more plentiful in agricultural areas, easier to acquire without cost. Flock, which was the short fibre byproduct of wool or cotton processing, appeared in pallets that were a step above the simplest variety, offering somewhat better loft and a surface that compressed more slowly. None of these materials were soft in the way we'd recognise as comfortable. But softness, again, was not the point. Some servants slept not even on pallets, but on benches. Narrow wooden benches along the walls of the great hall, which had been seats during the day, became sleeping surfaces at night for the lowest ranking members of a large household. A bench at least had the virtue of being wood rather than stone, and wood does not conduct cold the way stone does. It was still hard, still narrow, still genuinely uncomfortable by any measure, but it was not the floor, and some people slept with rolled fabric or bundles of clothing placed beneath them as additional cushioning and insulation, improvising the function of a pallet with whatever came to hand. Layering was the logic that governed all of this. Not one perfect sleeping surface, but several imperfect ones stacked together. A layer of straw on the floor, with a piece of rough cloth over it, with a thin blanket underneath you and another pulled over you, each layer doing a small part of the job, none of them enough on their own, the combination of them adding up to something that was survivable, and on a cold night near a banked fire, sometimes even genuinely warm. Bedding was also shared in ways that multiplied its effectiveness. Two people sharing a pallet and the covers on top of it were retaining body heat between them in a way that one person alone could not. We'll come back to the subject of sleeping arrangements and shared warmth more fully in a moment, but it belongs here too in the context of materials, because the choice to sleep close to another person was itself a thermal strategy as much as it was a social one. What the records also tell us when they bother to mention bedding at all is that it required maintenance that went beyond simply rolling it up in the morning. Straw and chaff compressed over time, flattening from the regular pressure of a body sleeping on them night after night, until the layer that had once been several inches thick was barely a suggestion of padding. Pests found their way into straw pallets readily enough, fleas and lice in particular, which made the bedding uncomfortable in ways that had nothing to do with cold, but that mattered considerably to the people sleeping in it. Damp was another constant threat, particularly in ground-level spaces or anywhere near exterior walls, because damp straw loses its insulating property and gains the ability to cause genuine misery. Fresh, dry straw smells clean and is reasonably pleasant. Wet, compressed, pest-ridden straw is something else entirely. The practical response to all of this was periodic replacement. Pallets were emptied and restuffed, old straw taken out and burned or spread on garden beds, fresh straw packed back in. How often this happened depended on the household, on the season, on who was responsible for managing it, and on whether anyone in a position of authority was paying attention to the condition of the sleeping quarters at all. In a well-run household, it happened regularly enough to make a difference. In a poorly run one, it may have happened only when the situation became truly unpleasant. But the awareness that bedding needed refreshing was there. It was part of the ordinary rhythm of managing a large household through the colder months. So the surface beneath you was one half of the equation. The other half was everything that went over you, and everything you wore when you lay down. Wool was the material that stood between most medieval people and serious cold, and this was not a coincidence or a matter of tradition for its own sake. Wool works. It traps air within its fibres in a way that holds warmth close to the body even when the surrounding temperature drops significantly. It resists moisture better than most natural materials, meaning that a wool blanket which had picked up a little damp from a stone floor or a cool night air was still doing a meaningful portion of its job, still holding heat in a way that a wet linen cloth simply would not. And wool remained available even at the lower end of the social scale, in a way that more refined materials did not. It might be rough, it might be coarse enough to scratch, but coarse wool over a sleeping body on a January night in a stone building was warmth, and warmth was the only measure that mattered. A servant who had a wool blanket had something genuinely valuable. Not valuable in the way a lord's embroidered coverlet was valuable, not an object you'd put in your will or that a steward would inventory with care, but valuable in the immediate and practical sense that it could keep you alive and functional through a cold night in a way that having nothing over you could not. Some servants would have had only one such blanket, others might have had two, or a blanket and a piece of heavy cloth that served a similar function. The difference between one layer and two was not trivial. Each additional layer reduced what was lost to the cold air above, and for people sleeping in draughty halls with no chamber of their own and no fire nearby, that reduction was felt. But blankets were not the whole picture, because medieval servants did not undress to sleep the way we think of undressing now. The concept of dedicated nightwear, garments made specifically for sleeping and for nothing else, was not part of the practical reality for most working people in a medieval household. What a servant wore to bed was, in most cases, a version of what they had been wearing during the day. The outer layers might come off. The heaviest work clothing might be set aside, partly to preserve it and partly because lying down in full daytime dress was simply impractical. But the underlayers stayed on. A linen shirt worn next to the skin was the foundation of most people's daily clothing, and at night it became the foundation of their sleeping warmth. Linen is not as warm as wool, but it served as a wicking layer that kept moisture away from the skin, and it covered the body in a way that mattered when the night was cold. Over that, a servant might keep on hose, the fitted leg coverings that were a standard part of medieval dress, because legs lose heat readily, and bare legs under a thin blanket on a cold night were an obvious problem. A cap worn over the head was common too, and practically significant. The head and neck release a disproportionate amount of body heat, and a simple cloth cap that kept that area covered through the night was doing real thermal work. It would have looked nothing like sleep clothing in the modern sense. It would have looked like a person who had taken off their outer layer and kept everything else on, because that is precisely what it was. This is where the question of status begins to make itself visible in the textiles. A wealthy household member, or someone in a senior position with access to better resources, might have a proper linen sleeping shirt, a garment cut and made for nighttime use specifically, lighter and longer than their work clothing, cleaner, softer against the skin. They might have a lined gown to pull over it if the night was particularly cold. They might have multiple blankets, or a blanket topped with a fur coverlet, because fur was an exceptional insulator and a reliable indicator of someone who had enough money to acquire it. The layers multiplied with wealth, and so did their quality. Finer wool, more closely woven, held warmth more efficiently than the coarse variety. A tightly woven blanket was measurably better than a loosely woven one of the same weight, because the tighter weave reduced the amount of cold air that could move through the fabric and strip the warmth from the space beneath. For servants at the lower end of the household, the layers were fewer and the quality was rougher, but the logic was exactly the same. You wore what you had. You pulled over yourself what was available. You kept the cap on, and the hose on, and the linen shirt on, because taking them off was not going to make you more comfortable. It was going to make you colder. The clothing was not separate from the warmth strategy. It was part of it, an integral part, working alongside the blanket and the pallet and the proximity to a fire in whatever combination the night allowed. And here the condition of the fabric becomes as important as the quantity of it. A dry wool blanket does its job. A damp one does it poorly. A linen shirt that is dried properly after washing is a functional layer. One that is still holding moisture from washing or from a damp storage space is a liability, carrying cold against the skin rather than helping to hold heat away from it. This was not a theoretical concern. Castle environments were damp, particularly in winter, and fabric stored in stone rooms or folded away in conditions that were not carefully managed picked up that damp readily. Servants who had the forethought or the circumstances to keep their sleeping textiles dry were better off than those who did not, sometimes significantly so, regardless of whether they had more or fewer items to sleep with. The layers you could pile on and the layers you kept against your skin were together what stood between you and the cold that came through the walls and off the floor and down from the ceiling of a room that had not been warm since summer. Stone buildings remember cold in a way that wood does not, and on the worst nights of a medieval winter, all the wool and linen a servant owned was barely enough to keep that memory from becoming a genuinely dangerous problem. And yet no amount of wool, however coarse or however carefully kept dry, could fully solve the problem on its own, because wool traps warmth, but warmth has to come from somewhere first. It has to be generated, and on a night when the fire had died down to nothing, and the stones were at their coldest, and the wind was finding every gap it could in the shutters and the doors, the most reliable source of warmth available to a medieval servant was not a blanket at all. It was another person. This is something that sounds almost quaint when you read it in a history book, but it was simply a fact of the physical world that people in the medieval period understood in a completely unsentimental way. A human body at rest produces heat continuously. Lying close to another body means two sources of heat rather than one, and the air trapped between two people sharing a sleeping space is warmer than the air surrounding a single person lying alone. Add a third person, and the effect compounds. Add a fourth, and you have created something that functions, in basic thermal terms, like a small and imperfect but genuinely effective system for staying alive through a cold night in a stone building. So servants slept together, not as a matter of personal choice and not with any particular tenderness attached to the arrangement, but as a straightforward, practical response to the conditions they were living in. Two servants sharing a pallet under a single blanket were warmer than either of them would have been sleeping alone. A group of lower servants sleeping together in a hall, bodies close enough to share heat even without direct contact, were all of them warmer than the same number of people spread out across the same space with air between them. This was known. It was practiced. It was, in many households, simply the way things were done, and nobody involved would have framed it as a comfort or a preference. It was a survival arrangement. The household itself had a hand in shaping these arrangements, because a medieval castle was not a place where servants simply chose where they slept based on their own inclinations. The structure of the household, the hierarchy of service, the discipline that kept a large working establishment functioning, all of this extended into the sleeping hours. Who slept where and near whom was not entirely a personal matter. It reflected rank and role and the expectations of the household as an institution. Senior servants might sleep in better positions, closer to a dying fire or in a room with a better door, and the people who slept near them were often those of similar standing. Not because warmth was being consciously distributed as a reward, but because proximity to better conditions tended to follow status through every part of castle life. Gender affected these arrangements in ways that were real and carefully observed, at least in theory. A well-run household maintained some degree of separation between male and female servants in the sleeping hours, because propriety demanded it, and because a household's reputation rested partly on the visible order of its domestic arrangements. Women who served in the chamber, ladies, maids, and attendants who waited on the mistress of the household often slept in or near their mistress's room, which was one of the warmer sleeping situations available to any servant. Given that a chamber occupied by the lord or lady of the house typically had a fireplace and rather better textile furnishings than anything in the hall below. That proximity was warmth, and it was one of the quiet practical advantages that came with chamber service over the more physically demanding work done elsewhere in the castle. For male servants, the arrangements were different in character, but similar in their basic logic. Men sleeping in the hall, or in the spaces between the hall and the outer buildings, slept in groups that were determined partly by where their work placed them, and partly by whatever space was available. A group of grooms sleeping in or near the stables had the additional warmth of the animals nearby, which was not nothing. A body of male household servants sleeping in the lower hall had each other, and the residual heat of the hearth, and whatever they had managed to pull over themselves. The grouping was practical, the arrangement was unsentimental, and the warmth produced was real. What was almost entirely absent from all of this was anything we would recognise as privacy. The idea that a person should sleep in a space of their own, with a door that closed against the rest of the household, was a luxury so profound that most servants would never have experienced it at all. Privacy in sleep was the province of the lord and lady, and perhaps of the most senior members of a household, people whose rank entitled them to a separate room and a closed door. For everyone below that level, sleep happened in shared space. Bodies were present in the same room, sometimes the same bed, because the alternative was cold, and cold was worse than the absence of privacy, and servants who had come from conditions of extreme poverty before entering service would not have found this particularly strange. In peasant households, multiple family members shared a single bed or sleeping space as a matter of course, because there was no other way to get through a winter night without freezing. The castle, for all its scale and grandeur, applied the same logic in the same way, just with more people and more complicated rules about who slept near whom. What you end up with, when you look at it clearly, is a picture of communal sleep as something entirely normalised, structured by the household's own hierarchy and by the basic social rules of the day, but ultimately driven by the same simple, physical reality that had always shaped how cold people slept. Warmth was scarce, bodies produced it. The most efficient thing to do was to put bodies together and keep what they generated from escaping too quickly into the cold stone air above. That was the logic, and it was sound, and it worked in the incomplete and imperfect way that most solutions to genuinely difficult problems work when the alternatives are worse. And all of that communal warmth, all of that careful pooling of bodies and blankets and shared heat existed within a larger framework of daily and nightly habit that was itself a kind of survival system. Because the medieval servant did not simply endure the cold as a passive experience, they moved through the day and the evening in ways that, even without anyone consciously designing it that way, built a rhythm of warmth and activity that made the cold hours more survivable than they might otherwise have been. Start with the body itself, and what happens to a body that has been working hard since before dawn? Physical labour generates heat. It does this in the most straightforward biological way imaginable, burning through fuel and producing warmth as a byproduct. And a servant who had spent the day hauling wood, carrying water, scrubbing floors, turning spits, beating textiles, or climbing the stairs of a castle repeatedly, throughout the long working hours of a winter day, arrived at the end of that day with a body that had been generating heat continuously for many hours. That warmth did not disappear instantly when the work stopped. It lingered. It sat in the muscles and the skin and made the first part of a cold night rather more bearable than the dead hours before dawn, when the body's own furnace had finally run low. Long work hours were the norm, and in winter they were the norm across the full stretch of daylight, and then some. Servants rose early, because the household required it, because fires needed to be lit, and meals needed to be prepared, and animals needed to be fed long before the lord and lady were awake, or the household had formally begun its day, and that early rising, as hard as it was in the cold dark of a winter morning, had the effect of compressing the time a servant spent lying still in the cold, the hours of lying motionless, which are the hours when the body cools fastest and the stone floor beneath the pallet seeps its chill most effectively upward, were shortened on both ends by the demands of work. You did not lie there long in the morning because the day came for you. You did not spend many idle hours in the evening because the body, exhausted, dropped into sleep relatively quickly once it was down. But between the end of the working day and the moment of sleep, there was a short window of evening routine that mattered considerably to what kind of night followed. Fires needed to be banked before the household settled. This was not simply a matter of fire safety, though it was that too. A banked fire, with its coals covered and its fuel arranged to burn slowly through the night, would produce far more residual warmth through the early hours than a fire left to burn brightly and then die completely before midnight. The person who banked the fire well was performing a small but genuine act of thermal management, one whose effects would still be felt several hours later by everyone sleeping in that room. Shutters were closed as darkness came on. This sounds trivial, but a castle in winter with open shutters was a significantly colder place than the same castle with its shutters latched against the wind. The gaps in wooden shutters were real and numerous, and no one pretended that closing them solved the problem entirely, but they reduced it. They kept the worst of the wind from moving freely through the room and stripping warmth from the air and from every surface inside. Closing the shutters was a habit, an automatic part of the evening, something done without reflection by servants who had learned through experience that it made a difference worth making. Bedding was gathered, arranged, layered up in whatever configuration made the most of what was available. Cloaks that had been worn through the day might go over the top of a sleeping pile, adding one more layer between the body and the cold air above. Any additional textile that could reasonably be pressed into service would be. This again was not comfort-seeking in any recognisable modern sense. It was efficiency, an automatic response to the conditions, shaped by years of practice, and by the simple feedback of having been warmer some nights than others, and knowing why. Food and drink mattered here more than almost anything else. Hot food eaten in the evening carried warmth into the body in a way that nothing external could entirely replicate. A bowl of pottage, taken hot, thick with whatever grain or vegetable the kitchen had available, warmed from the inside in a way that a blanket simply could not. Ale was drunk warm in the colder months, or at least at the temperature of the kitchen, rather than the temperature of a cold store, and ale in this period had caloric value as well as warmth, providing fuel for the body's own heat-generating work. Access to the kitchen in the evenings was therefore not just a social convenience, it was a survival advantage. Servants whose work brought them close to the kitchen fires in the evening hours, even briefly, benefited from that proximity in ways that were measurable in how they felt lying down an hour later. What is striking when you look at all of this together is how much of it was simply habit. None of these practices were policies written down and distributed to servants as instructions for winter survival. They were things that people learned by doing, absorbed from older servants, adapted through experience, passed along without ceremony, because they worked and because not doing them was noticeably worse. The servant who skipped banking the fire one night and found the room unbearably cold by 2 a.m. did not need to be told twice. The routine embedded itself through consequence. There is something almost invisible about survival practices that have become habitual. They stop looking like strategies and start looking like just the way things are done. And that is exactly what winter routine was for a medieval castle servant. Not a conscious system for managing cold, but a set of ingrained habits, morning and evening, and throughout the long working day, that together kept a body warm enough to wake up the next morning and do it all again. The comfort was not in any single thing they did. It was in the accumulation of all of it, layered up like blankets, each one thin on its own, but together making something that held. And if there was one place in the castle where that accumulation of warmth was most concentrated, most physical, most immediately felt, it was the kitchen. Not every servant had access to it. Not every servant slept near it. But those who did occupied what was, by the standards of medieval castle life, something close to a privileged thermal position. The kitchen was its own environment, distinct from the rest of the castle in ways that went well beyond its function. It was a different kind of space, warmer by degrees that mattered enormously, when those degrees were the difference between sleeping and shivering, between waking rested and waking stiff with cold. The reason was straightforward. Where most rooms in a castle had one hearth, used for part of the day, and banked or left cold for much of the night, the kitchen had multiple heat sources, and used them almost continuously. Large ovens built into the walls held heat long after the last loaf had been pulled from them. Hearths designed for roasting and boiling burned on a scale that nothing in the great hall or the Lord's chamber could quite match, because the quantities of food a functioning noble household required meant sustained, serious, industrial scale fire. In winter especially, the kitchen fires were among the last in the castle to be fully reduced, and the first to be brought back up. Because breakfast for a large household is not produced without fire, and fire does not produce itself. The kitchen was therefore warm in a structural sense, not accidentally warm, warm by necessity and design, because the work it housed demanded it. Cooks, scullions, kitchen boys, and the various workers whose days revolved around that space knew this better than anyone. They lived alongside that warmth through the working hours, and for some of them, the proximity did not end when the work did. There is reasonable evidence, both from written sources and from what we understand about castle spatial arrangements, that servants whose duties were tied to the kitchen often slept in or very near it. Not in formal beds, not in spaces assigned to them with any particular ceremony. On the floor near a cooling oven, against the wall closest to the hearth, in whatever corner offered the least draught and the most residual heat from the stones that had been absorbing fire all day. The stones themselves were the key. Thick kitchen walls and hearth surrounds soaked up heat over hours of burning and released it slowly through the night, long after the flames had been reduced to embers. Sleeping near those stones was sleeping near a body of accumulated warmth that worked differently from a fire itself, quietly and gradually, giving back what the day had poured into it. For a kitchen boy or a scullion, particularly one who was young and low in the household hierarchy, and therefore not entitled to any specific sleeping space elsewhere, the kitchen could be a genuine refuge. The word is the right one. It implies both shelter and a degree of difficulty outside its walls, and both of those things were true. The rest of the castle in winter, the passageways, the towers, the service rooms that threaded between working areas, the upper floors where air moved freely through gaps in stonework and wind pressed against shutters that never quite sealed, these places were cold in a way the kitchen simply was not. A tower room on the north side of a castle in January was a different experience from falling asleep on the kitchen floor with an oven at your back. The stone in those towers had no warmth stored in it. It had cold stored in it, a deep structural chill that came not from any single night but from months of winter accumulated in its mass. Walking into a tower passageway in the small hours was walking into something that felt actively hostile, a cold that reached through clothing and made movements slow and deliberate. The kitchen offered the opposite of that, and the trade-off, because there was always a trade-off, was real but manageable. The kitchen was never quiet, in quite the way a sleeping room might aspire to be. Embers shifted, pots left to simmer overnight made small sounds. Other bodies were nearby, and not always still. The smell of the kitchen was dense and layered, grease and smoke, and the ghost of everything cooked that day, and ventilation was imperfect at best. In winter, the smoke problem was genuine, because all the measures taken to reduce drafts, the closed shutters, the banked fires, the bodies filling space, also reduced the movement of air that carried smoke away. A kitchen that had been burning hard all day could have a quality of air in the evening that was far from pleasant, and a servant sleeping through the night in that atmosphere was breathing something considerably thicker than the cold, clear air outside. But cold, clear air at 15 degrees of frost was not actually the better option. The smoke was unpleasant, the cold was dangerous. Servants made the calculation they had to make, and the kitchen floor, with its warm stones and its residual fire, was a more survivable choice than a drafty corner somewhere else in the building. The hierarchy of warmth mattered here too, and it operated in the kitchen as firmly as it operated everywhere else in the castle. The warmest spots were not equally available to everyone. A senior cook did not sleep on the kitchen floor if he could help it. He had accumulated enough standing to claim a space elsewhere, perhaps a small room adjacent to the kitchen, close enough to benefit from its warmth, but removed enough for some minimal privacy. The most desirable positions within the kitchen itself, directly beside the oven wall, sheltered from the doorways, low to the floor, where rising heat had already passed. These went to whoever had enough seniority or enough physical presence to hold them. A young kitchen boy might sleep warm by the grace of being small enough to fit in a corner that no one else wanted, or he might sleep in a draught because everyone above him had already claimed what was better. What the kitchen represented in the end was the castle's warmest working margin, a space where the requirements of the household's own function had accidentally produced conditions that were survivable in ways other parts of the building were not. Those lucky enough to orbit it closely, whose work kept them there, whose position allowed them to remain, held something genuinely valuable through the long cold months, and those whose duties took them to the far corners of the building, the night watchmen, the grooms, the workers in storerooms and cellars, knew the difference in their bones every morning. And yet even the kitchen's warmth, that hard-won refuge of accumulated fire and thick stone, was not experienced equally by everyone who lived and worked in a medieval castle, because no two castles were quite the same, and no two winters were quite the same either. It is easy, when imagining medieval life, to picture a single version of it, a generalised castle somewhere in the northern imagination, grey stone, bare trees, frost on the ground, a standardised cold. But the actual geography of medieval Europe stretched across an enormous range of climates, and the people who served in castles from Edinburgh to the Loire Valley to the hill towns of Central Europe were not living through the same winter. They were not facing the same threats, and they were not making the same adjustments. Scotland was its own particular ordeal. The cold that was rarely the sharp, dry cold of a hard continental frost. It was wet. A Scottish winter came with wind that carried rain into places snow would never reach, that soaked through wool and settled into joints, that made the stone not just cold but damp in a way that felt like the building itself was sweating inward. The famous grey light of a Scottish January is not a poetic abstraction. It is the physical reality of a place where warmth, when it existed at all, had to be generated from inside the body and defended against the air from all directions. Servants in a Scottish castle were not just cold. They were working against a specific kind of penetrating, relentless moisture that was in some respects more wearing than any amount of dry frost. France was different again. The Loire Valley, where so many of the great French chateaux would eventually rise, had winters cold enough to matter, but tempered by a climate closer to the Atlantic margin, variable, changeable, sometimes surprisingly mild, and then suddenly sharp again. A servant in a castle there might go 3 weeks in January without particular suffering, and then face a single, brutal week that undid any sense of comfort they had built. Central Europe was harsher in a more straightforward way. Longer winters, deeper frosts, the kind of cold that was simply constant rather than variable, which in its own fashion had the advantage of predictability. You knew it was coming. You could prepare for it. England sat somewhere in the middle of all this, damp and wind-prone like its northern neighbours, rarely as cold as the continental interior, but rarely warm enough to be casual about winter either. The key word across all of these conditions is damp. Snow is cold, but it is also dry, and dry cold, unpleasant as it is, does not strip heat from the body the way wet cold does. A servant sleeping in a draughty room on a night of hard frost might manage, huddled under enough layers, sharing enough warmth with nearby bodies. The same servant on a night of driving rain and cold wet wind in a building where the walls had been absorbing moisture for weeks was in more serious difficulty. Wet stone does not just fail to provide warmth, it actively takes it. The chill of a damp castle in the grey middle of winter was something different in character from the chill of a cold but dry one. This affected how household arrangements shifted across the year. Seasonal adjustment was real and practical. In the hardest months, fuel allocations changed. Hearths that might be allowed to go cold on a mild autumn night were kept burning longer. Servants who slept in outer buildings or in passages that connected the castle's working areas to its more exposed structures, might be permitted by necessity rather than kindness to find sleeping space closer to the main household's heat. The distance between where different ranks of servants were allowed to be, which was always carefully maintained, sometimes quietly collapsed under the pressure of actual winter. Castle occupation itself shifted with the seasons in ways that bear remembering. Not every castle was occupied in the same way throughout the year. A great lord with multiple properties moved between them, and when a castle was not the principal seat of residence for a given period, the household that remained was smaller. A skeleton staff, fewer bodies, less fire, less heat generated by accumulated human presence in rooms and corridors. The servants left to manage a partially occupied castle in deep winter were in a different situation from those supporting a full household in residence. They had fewer resources, less collective warmth, and the same stone around them. Travel itself was a factor. When a lord moved his household from one castle to another in winter, the servants who travelled with him faced exposure that sleeping in even a cold castle could not match, and the castle they were leaving behind fell into a kind of suspended cold that the small remaining staff had to manage as best they could. None of this resolved itself into a single pattern. That is perhaps the most important thing to hold on to when thinking about how medieval servants endured the cold. There was no single medieval castle experience. A servant in a 13th century English castle in the South Midlands, sleeping near the kitchen in a household of moderate size, was living something meaningfully different from a servant in a castle on the Scottish borders, or in a hilltop fortress in the Auvergne, or in a tower house in the Rhine Valley. The stone was different. The wind was different. The damp was different. The season arrived differently and left differently. What they shared was the fundamental condition: stone buildings, limited fire, insufficient insulation, and the necessity of surviving the night in bodies that were already tired from a day of labour. What varied was how extreme that condition became, and how many tools they had to meet it. The variation also meant that not every servant was fighting for survival in any dramatic sense. Some managed well, some had enough, some lived in conditions that were hard by any reasonable measure, but not immediately dangerous, and some, in the worst corners of the worst castles in the worst winters, in the most exposed parts of Northern Europe, were genuinely at risk in ways that the more comfortable inhabitants of those same buildings rarely had cause to consider. And that risk, when it arrived, did not usually arrive suddenly. It crept in. This is worth pausing on, because the title of this video asks a fairly dramatic question. How did servants in medieval castles sleep without freezing to death? And there is a version of the answer that leans into the drama, that imagines servants huddled in corners, inches from death, surviving each night through sheer desperation. That version is not exactly accurate. Most servants, most of the time, were not freezing to death. They were not waking up each morning having narrowly survived the darkness. The cold was a chronic condition of their lives, not a nightly emergency, and it is important to be honest about that, because overstating the danger makes it harder to understand what the actual danger was. The actual danger was quieter. It was cumulative. It was the kind of risk that did not announce itself with a single catastrophic night, but built slowly across weeks and months of inadequate warmth, damp surroundings, insufficient sleep, and bodies already worn down by physical labour. Think about what the conditions actually were. Bedding that was rarely fully dry, stone floors and walls that absorbed moisture and held it, smoke from hearths and torches that did not always vent properly, filling sleeping spaces with particulate air that sat in the lungs night after night, bodies that were tired when they lay down, having spent the day carrying, lifting, hauling, cleaning, stoking and serving, and tired again when they rose before full light to begin the same work over. These conditions did not kill people outright, but they wore at the body's defences in ways that made everything else harder. Respiratory illness was the most direct consequence. The combination of cold, damp, smoke, and poor ventilation created exactly the conditions in which the lungs struggled. Coughs that settled in and did not leave, chest tightness that made the morning hours difficult, the kind of persistent respiratory trouble that in a modern setting would seem manageable, but in a medieval one, without antibiotics, without reliable warmth, without the option of rest when the household still needed its work done, could become genuinely serious. A servant who developed a deep winter cough and had no way to properly recover, who had to continue rising in the dark and working through the cold, regardless of how their chest felt, was in a more precarious situation than the initial illness alone would suggest. There were also the more diffuse effects. Joint pain, the particular aching stiffness that comes from sleeping on surfaces that hold cold, from spending long hours in damp air, from the kind of low-level chronic cold exposure that never quite becomes severe enough to demand attention, but never fully relents either. Older servants, or those whose bodies had been carrying the accumulated strain of years of hard physical work, would have felt this most. The cold did not need to be dangerous in an obvious sense to make a person's life significantly harder. And then there is exhaustion itself as a health risk. Sleep that is interrupted by cold, by discomfort, by the necessity of waking to tend a fire, or because the temperature has dropped enough to make continued sleep difficult, is not restorative in the way the body needs. A person who has not slept properly is more vulnerable to illness. Their immune response is weaker. Their reaction times are slower. Their judgment is less reliable. For servants whose work involved physical labour near fire, near horses, near the heavy machinery of a castle's daily operation, reduced alertness was not a minor inconvenience. It was a real source of risk that is easy to overlook when we focus only on the cold itself. What made all of this worse, and this is something that appears in the previous section's logic, but carries forward here, was the way these risks were distributed unevenly. Not all servants faced them equally. The hierarchy of the medieval household that determined who slept where, who had access to warmth, who could count on a share of fire and dry bedding and covered space, was also a hierarchy of physical risk. The servants at the bottom of that structure, the lowest ranked workers, the newest, the youngest, the ones doing the dirtiest and most exposed tasks, were the ones sleeping furthest from any source of heat, on the least protected surfaces, in the spaces where drafts were strongest and moisture accumulated most readily. A senior household officer sleeping in a chamber relatively close to a hearth, with proper bedding and perhaps a door that fit its frame reasonably well, was not facing the same winter as a young kitchen boy sleeping near an outer door on a straw pallet that had been damp for 6 weeks. Both were servants, both were subject to the cold, but the gap between their actual conditions was significant, and its health consequences were significant too. The poorest and most junior workers were also the least likely to have recourse when they became ill. A household that valued a skilled steward or a reliable senior cook would make some accommodation for their incapacity. A young labouring servant was more replaceable, and the pressure to continue working regardless of how they felt would have been considerable. The cold did its work not just by lowering temperatures, but by creating conditions in which the people most exposed to its effects had the fewest means to recover from them. None of this is to say that medieval castle servants were living in constant mortal danger. The evidence does not support that picture. People adapted, they managed. The strategies that have come up throughout this video, the shared warmth, the proximity to kitchens, the accumulated layers, the seasonal adjustments in how space was used, these were not incidental. They were the practical intelligence of people who understood their environment and worked within it as effectively as they could. But chronic discomfort is real harm. The fact that a person is not dying does not mean they are not suffering, and the fact that medieval servants largely survived the winter does not mean that winter was not extracting a cost from them, in aching joints, in damaged lungs, in exhausted bodies, in the accumulated toll of months spent in conditions that the people they served would never have accepted for themselves. The cold was not a dramatic villain in most of these lives. It is a steady, quiet, persistent pressure, and the people at the bottom of the household faced the most of it, with the least protection against it, and with the fewest choices about how to respond. So where does all of this actually come from? When historians talk about how medieval servants slept, or what their bedding looked like, or how close they were allowed to get to a fire, what are they actually drawing on? It is a fair question, and it deserves a careful answer. Because the honest truth is that the evidence for ordinary servant life in medieval castles is fragmentary, indirect, and often frustratingly incomplete. And understanding that does not undermine what we know. It actually makes what we do know more interesting. The first thing to understand is that servants, by and large, did not write about themselves. The people who slept on pallets near outer doors and rose before dawn to carry water and stoke fires were not, as a rule, keeping journals. They were not composing letters describing the quality of their blankets or the temperature of the room where they spent the night. Literacy in the medieval period was distributed very unevenly, concentrated among the clergy, among the educated elite, among those who had both the learning and the leisure to put words on parchment. The everyday experiences of the lowest ranked workers in a great household went almost entirely unrecorded in their own voices. That silence is itself something historians have to reckon with, because it shapes everything else. What does survive tends to survive, because it served an administrative or economic purpose. Household accounts are one of the richest sources available, and they can tell us a remarkable amount, but they tell it sideways. An account that records the purchase of a quantity of straw for bedding tells us that straw bedding was in use. An entry noting the acquisition of blankets for the servants' dormitory tells us that a dormitory of some kind existed. A record of firewood allocation, of candle distribution, of payments to workers who slept on the premises. All of these things add up to a picture. But it is a picture built from the edges rather than the centre. The accounts were not written to describe sleeping arrangements. They were written to track expenditure. The sleeping arrangements are something we read out of them, carefully, and with some inference involved. Architectural remains offer another angle, though they come with their own complications. When historians and archaeologists examine surviving castle structures, or the foundations and layouts of those that no longer stand, they can identify spaces that were likely used for servant sleeping. Rooms positioned near working areas of the castle, spaces that lack the features associated with elite occupation, areas adjacent to kitchens or stables or service corridors. These give us some sense of where ordinary workers were housed. But stone does not record temperature. It does not tell us how many people shared a room, or what they wore to bed, or whether the fire in the corner stayed lit through the night, or burned down to nothing by the second hour after midnight. The architecture gives us the container. It does not give us the experience inside it. Inventories are useful in a slightly different way. When a household compiled a list of its goods, which happened for various administrative and legal reasons, it sometimes included descriptions of items associated with servant quarters. Mattresses, blankets, wooden bed frames, straw pallets. These appear in inventories, and they confirm that such items existed in the quantities and qualities described. But inventories too are limited. They record what was there at a particular moment, not how it was used, not whether it was adequate, not whether the blanket listed in the inventory was the same blanket available to the servant shivering through a January night, or whether it was locked away somewhere and only produced for the purpose of the count. There are also instructional texts, household manuals, and conduct literature that sometimes address the management of servants and the arrangement of a great household. These are genuinely illuminating sources, but they carry a particular bias worth noting. They describe how things were supposed to be organised, not necessarily how they actually functioned in practice. A manual that instructs a household steward to ensure that servants have adequate bedding and do not sleep in the great hall after a certain hour tells us that these were considered appropriate standards. It does not tell us whether those standards were consistently met, whether they applied equally to all ranks of servant, or whether the instruction itself was prompted by the fact that the opposite was commonly happening. Then there is literature. Medieval literature does occasionally feature servants, and the glimpses it offers of their daily lives can feel vivid and immediate. But literature is not documentation. It selects for drama, for humour, for moral illustration. It is not trying to be accurate in the way a historian needs sources to be accurate. The same is true, in an even more compressed way, of how castle life appears in modern film and television. The tendency there is almost always toward one of two extremes. Either the castle is rendered as a kind of gloomy, stone-cold misery, where everyone is perpetually on the edge of hypothermia, or it is softened into something almost comfortable, with roaring fires in every corner and servants who seem remarkably well rested and warmly dressed. Neither picture is fully trustworthy, and both reflect the storytelling needs of the medium more than the actual complexity of the historical record. What all of this means is that historians working on the material conditions of ordinary medieval life are engaged in a constant act of careful reconstruction. They are taking what the household accounts actually say and reading it alongside what the architecture suggests and testing that against the inventories and triangulating with the conduct literature, and then being honest about which parts of the resulting picture are well supported, which are plausible inferences, and which are speculative. The best historical work on this subject is always doing that work explicitly, distinguishing between what the evidence shows, what the evidence implies, and what remains genuinely uncertain. That distinction matters for a video like this one. Most of what has been described here about servant sleeping arrangements sits somewhere on a spectrum between well evidenced and reasonably inferred. The broad outlines are solid. Servants slept in a range of arrangements depending on their rank and function. They had access to varying degrees of warmth and comfort. The lowest ranked workers were the most exposed. The kitchen was a genuine source of warmth that many people sought proximity to. These things are supported by the sources, read carefully, but the finer details, the precise temperature of a particular room, the exact quality of a specific servant's bedding, the way an individual person felt about their sleeping arrangements, those things are almost entirely lost. The human texture of these lives, the particular reality of what it felt like to be that kitchen boy, on that straw pallet, on that cold January night. That is something the sources can gesture toward, but cannot quite deliver. And sitting with that uncertainty, honestly, is, in its own way, a form of respect for the people whose lives we are trying to understand. So after all of that, what is the actual answer to the question we started with? How did servants in medieval castles sleep without freezing to death? The honest answer is that they managed it through a combination of things, none of them individually dramatic, but together surprisingly effective. They layered their clothing, they shared their sleeping spaces, they positioned themselves as close to sources of heat as their rank and role allowed. They built routines around the rhythms of the working day that kept bodies active and fires burning and kitchens warm long into the night. It was not comfortable by any standard we would recognise today, but it was not simply passive suffering either. It was adaptation, practical and accumulated over generations, built into the fabric of how a great household actually operated. What is striking when you sit with it is how different the underlying expectation was. We tend to approach warmth and privacy as baseline requirements, things a person is entitled to, the floor below which conditions become unacceptable. For a medieval servant, those things were not the floor. They were somewhere near the ceiling, available to the high-ranking and the fortunate, and simply not part of the calculation for everyone else. Endurance was not considered a hardship to be remedied. It was closer to a given, a feature of the world, as it was, absorbed into the body and the routine without much apparent expectation that it ought to be otherwise. That is not a romantic thought. It is just a different relationship between people and their physical circumstances, shaped by a world that had no central heating, no insulated walls, no way to make a stone building genuinely warm in the way we now take for granted. And it is worth saying clearly that castles were never designed with the comfort of ordinary servants in mind. The architectural priorities of a great medieval fortress were power and defence, and the visible projection of wealth and status. The Lord's chambers were positioned for prestige. The great hall was designed for ceremony and display. The spaces where servants slept were arranged around what was convenient for the work they needed to do, not around what would keep them comfortable through a cold night. That hierarchy of space was not incidental. It was built into the stone, into the logic of how the building was conceived. To expect equal warmth throughout a medieval castle is to misread what the castle was actually for, none of which means servants were simply helpless in the face of winter. That would be its own kind of distortion. The picture that emerges from the sources, read carefully and honestly, is of people who were cold often, sometimes genuinely dangerously cold, but who also had real and practical strategies for managing that cold. They knew where the heat was. They knew how to share it. They knew which tasks kept blood moving and which rooms held warmth longest after the fire burned down. That knowledge was worth something. It was not nothing. What tends to get lost in both directions, in the romanticised version and in the grimly miserable version, is just this quality of ordinary human resourcefulness operating within real constraints. The servant sleeping near the kitchen hearth, on a straw pallet under a rough blanket, was not living in some picturesque fairy tale, but they were also not simply a figure of pure suffering. They were a person getting through the night in the ways available to them, which is something people have always found ways to do. That image, grounded and unglamorous and quietly human, is probably the most accurate thing this video can leave you with. The cold was real. The limitations were real. But so was the knowledge, the routine, the shared warmth, and the practical intelligence of people who understood their world in ways the sources can only begin to show us.